Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions. 3. All right. Welcome, gentlemen.
Oh, Guy, good to see
Welcome,
you, my
Clayton.
friend.
Welcome, Mr. Rose. I'm excited. I'm excited to have you guys. Both your Zoom selves meeting my Zoom self on my screen.
We are.
And welcome to Hawaii. That's where I'm hosting the meeting. And I just got off a pineapple tour with a very consumerist little venture. It's like you're in this. I'm on Maui, which is like a big thou, right? And so we just go on this little it tour. It was really it made me a little homicidal by the end.
I just have this image of like riding around looking at the pineapples cracking them. It's precious. It really makes my evening, Guy.
Yes,
I appreciate it.
everyone taking picture of the person at the pineapple and like the just getting off the little bus and like it was like a quarter of a mile little loop around. I was just like, and we're driving back, and everyone's just tense.
They're like, it's like, are we having pineapple when we get back for dinner?
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah. It is really I mean, I have to say, it is really something. Like I was thinking about this, just kind of watching people be on vacation, right? And everyone's got their cameras out, right? And everyone has a certain kind of look on their face. It's like it's like without even thinking about it, they're here to possess Hawaii. They're here to consume and get something from Hawaii. And it's weird because they completely stand out. Like they stand out like you could just tell like they're tourists somewhere, right? It's like they just stand out of the environment, like outside of it the whole time, kind of like looking in or something. They've just brought wherever they were here and they just stay inside of it. And then they look out their window or something like that. I was just like, this is, there's something about that that just seems so fucking modern.
Oh, I'll just jump in and comment because I think it is very interesting. I think a lot about how in that Emerson essay, Self-Reliance, where he says, it's bad never to travel, but then there's also a kind of danger in the traveling that's just collecting a list of experiences where you're just doing it because you're consuming. And there's also an Italian philosopher, and I can't think of his name, that talks about how there's this almost new barbaricism of just traveling and not making any roots anywhere, but you're going and enjoying the cool coffee shops in Europe and these different things. You're kind of consuming, but you yourself are not going to create a place that people would want to travel to, but you're going almost like collecting things like barbarians and different things. And I do wonder if it's possible to travel if you don't know how to be at home. I do wonder, like, there's something about in the way that you see the person on vacation that kind of stands out. I do wonder sometimes if human beings today, almost because they don't know how to have leisure, scole, I know are topics, if they almost stand out as kind of alien, like, if they have any place where they kind of belong. Ivan Illich talked a lot about the problem of there's no dwelling anymore, that most houses are not homes, they're more like apartments. There are places you sleep at between work. You don't actually dwell in your home anymore. And I sometimes wonder if the vacation culture is actually just a vivid snapshot of how everyone's always living now. It just really stands out because there's a way in which it's so obvious and vivid that they're on vacation or they're kind of sticking out. But actually, that's almost all of us now because we struggle to know how to talk with one another. We struggle to know how to really get lost in art. We know how to consume art, but to get lost in art, I don't know. We know how to have small talk, but to get lost in conversation, I don't know. And there's something about the human need to be able to be part of the scene, like part of the scenery, but not in a kind of invisible way, but like, oh, they're part of the work of art. It's almost like you should look at people and be like, of course they'd be here. They're part of the landscape. This is Cezanne. You would expect to see these things. And it kind of makes me feel like it's important to travel in a manner to where you are trying to participate in the art of the place, not just consume it. And I think it makes me, and I'll give it to Clayton. It just makes me think of the importance of actually doing something similar in conversation, in home, in work, to not kind of stand out as obviously there just to consume, as obviously there just to almost receive something. Not that everyone who travels does this or anything, but you can even think about people who you like can talk to sometimes who are just kind of waiting for you to say something for them to respond to. Like, okay, tell me about your job. Okay, tell me about your, what you did today. Okay, good. Like you see this kind of approach the conversation in a consumer way. And it just feels, it also feels like when you vacation that way, there's a risk of you're not really there. You're not really there. You're still in your own kind of enclosure of yourself. You're not really participating in everything. So it is very interesting. And it also, I do also think the vacation is kind of a counterfeit of leisure. Sometimes it's like a kind of counterfeit of leisure that's it's almost like we don't know how to have leisure in that Piper sense. So, but we know how to look like we're at leisure. We know the performances of leisure. We know what to look like as opposed to actually be part of a new place and to actually flow. Just like we know what it looks like to rest, sit in front of the TV, watch it, go to a movie. We know what it looks like to be in like friendship. Okay, we went to a restaurant together, as opposed to actually knowing as a human being how to be engrossed in something, how to actually be part of something and part of the terrain. Those thoughts came to mind as you were speaking.
Right.
Yeah. You've touched on a few things that like blew up a few open doors in my mind right now. Could go for like a whole hour monologue, but I'll try to touch on them a little bit. So with the vacating thing, these days it really feels, it reminds me of the having mode, the Vaveki having mode versus being mode. And I think what you're describing there has to do with actually being there. Like, I think because the point is to empty out, to vacate, like empty this self out so that you can create room for another self to come in. And that self can be constructed through the experience that you're having. However, you actually the way to have the experience is by participating in it. It's like you experience by doing the experience, right? And so I feel like vacation is almost like a pilgrimage type thing we should be aiming for. It's like, unlocking that wonder, that curiosity, and just trying to be in that place. We recently went on a vacation to Tasmania, and at some point we were getting trapped into the touristy mode. Of course, we still fell in many of the touristy traps, but I remember this one vivid moment where we had to go to the city to kind of like take a bus tour, and we're debating, should we call like a taxi, because it's so convenient, he'll just come pick us up here, take us to wherever we need to go. And somebody said, no, how about we just find the bus? Like, where's the bus? Let's walk to the bus stop. Let's take the bus. Let's figure out how the people here actually, do life every day. And I think that is going to deepen our experience. And we did that, and it was amazing. And every time we had to go to the city, we decided we're going to take the bus because a lot of things happened, a lot of unplanned things happened.
Yeah.
And all those became the experiences we got to remain with. Like they really stood out to us. And so I feel like we have to do we have to be aware of that. And despite being in a, you'd say, in a time whereby having things, consuming things is the norm, we have to actively work at not doing that
Yeah.
and breaking that pattern so that we can open ourselves up and be drawn into the experience that is there and sort of like just be
Mm.
in it the way we should be rather than trying to take something out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, there's I'm 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 thinking of in your guys' last conversation together, which I really enjoyed. And it had me write you guys and go, we should all talk. In the beginning, I think Clayton, you were talking about something like I don't know if it was an example or something that actually happened, but where you were like, there was some communication from your wife, and then you said you've been kind of examining these these interactions, right? That it sounds like what I heard was, you didn't exactly say this, but what I heard is like those interactions that don't necessarily feel all that good, right? Like, what's up with this, right? And you said a couple of things that struck me. Like one is you said, "All right, wait a minute. This person loves me. So if they really love me, which I think they really do, they ultimately want the best for me. So if they're saying something, right, and it looks offensive, or I can't get it, or it doesn't make any sense to me, or something like that, right? It's like I must not be understanding it all the way, right? And then he started talking about like, okay, well, how do I go about approaching understanding this? And basically, he started to talk about getting context, right? Like, and you use this example of, oh, well, first it was like in the communication happened in the kitchen, and all the kids are in the kitchen, and there's noise, and so maybe I didn't hear everything, and then kind of like, right, and then you went kind of deeper and you just basically walked your way into the background context, right, of this. And I thought to myself, I'm like, that's a couple of things. Like, there's something about the way that you walked into your wife, right? And the attitude that you took and the intention that you had and the assumption that you didn't know and that there was more to know, right? Seems something like you weren't being a tourist.
Yeah, totally. I don't think I was being like I had to break out of the touristy mode, right?
Yeah.
Because it didn't feel aligned, right? Like, what is it? The cognitive dissonance. It's
Yeah.
like I am pretty sure they love me. Like I am so certain about this.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence for that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what is it? If I think they're behaving in a way that is not that,
Yeah.
then there's definitely something I'm missing. And so,
Yeah.
uh, and this had been going on for ages because, it happens without being aware of it. Like you
Yeah.
just fall in the trap. Like you kind of like, going to the pineapple tour and buying some, you know,
Yeah.
pineapple sculptures, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And riding home and then wondering like, oh, why did I bring a pineapple sculpture, right? And so it was kind of like one of those things.
Yeah.
But it was so vivid, making that assumption and breaking out of it and going like, yeah, definitely I'm missing something. And the moment you do that,
Mhm.
like all of a sudden, whatever you're missing starts to pop up. It's like, yeah, it could be that. That's a possibility. That's a possibility. There's some data you're missing. Here's
Yeah.
something that if you add it in, it changes the
Yeah.
landscape of it. So um, that was kind of like a journey of discovery. And the moment I did that,
Yeah.
like all the interactions with everyone in the family changed. Because I remember at the time, my daughter, she was just a few months old, I think about, 2 months or so. And now
Mhm.
I could look at her and I could get her, right? It's like, oh no, I get what she's saying. And
Yeah.
it was so bizarre because it's a cry, right? And
Yeah.
I'm saying, I get
Yeah.
what you're saying. When you watch that movie, whatever, The Guardians of the Galaxy, and Groot's going on, and you're like, what is he doing? I
Yeah.
don't get this. But
Yeah.
in that moment, it just became alive. And it's like, oh wow, this is what Groot was doing with that little raccoon. Like they got each other at a level below language that it was more, it was like they went before the language. Like it was more like a resonance. It's like,
Yeah.
I get it. It feels this way. And so like leaning into it and knowing what it feels like. And then
Yeah.
and then it starts to guide you what you need to pay attention to. So all of a sudden, and we spoke about this with Daniel, like the definitions start to fall to the background and they become irrelevant. And all of a sudden it's like, no, 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 I hear them. I completely hear them, even if whatever they're saying they're not aware of,
Yeah.
and they're not, like, I'm not drawing the attention to whatever is being inarticulate or whatever is not being clear. I'm drawing attention to what is clear. And so it's like the more you amplify what is clear and how
Yeah.
you're hearing it, and sort
Yeah.
of drawing attention to that, all of a sudden there's this confidence in not being hesitant to being wrong. It's like all of a sudden being wrong is not a problem, and now it's more like, oh, I think they're hearing me, so I'm just gonna reveal more of myself. And it reminds me, I was having a chat about this with a friend yesterday, and they mentioned something about feeling like they were being gaslit by, I think, a partner or someone. And they were describing this. And so like the gaslit idea
Yeah.
like stuck to me. It's like, what does that really, really mean? Like
Yeah.
I've had a lot of people use that phrase, but I don't know what it means. And so this morning I was asking my wife what it means to her. And the way she describes it is not how it's normally taken. Um, but eventually we talk about it and we get to a place whereby we're trying to understand how can somebody get to a situation where they feel like they're gaslit? Like what should be missing for them to submit, you say their interpretation of the reality that's going on around them to someone else to suggest that, such that they can completely consume that. And I think it's still the touristy thing, right? It's like uh, I'm I'm not gonna mine my own reality for myself. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna take whatever you're giving me. So Daniel, guy, give me something, and if it doesn't work, it's all you guys' fault. I'm not responsible for it. Because then you start to hear the statements like, "They made me do something," or "They told me to," or "I got this idea from so and so. It's terrible idea." It's like, yeah, but where's your agency, right? Like, how did you? Because you did something, right? How do we account for that? And I think there's a lot of reasons of why it arises. Like, for example, where I come from, where I grew up, it's like, yeah, there's this common expectation in society, right? Like, you like children are a lower class, right? Like if you're a child, you get told what to do and you're trying to learn to be good. And all those who learn to successfully be good children do that at the expense of killing off their own curiosity and creativity. And so they just conform and they're very good at conforming. And this is great, like during childhood, because then your parents have such a breeze and they don't have to contend with you. Only until you don't have them, or then you no longer you've outgrown parenting, and now
Yeah.
you have to sort of like parent yourself, and then it becomes a challenge,
Yeah.
and now you have to start seeking to try to outsource this parenting, and then you're at a job and it's like, oh, I can't make decisions nobody's telling me. It's like, well,
And
we're hiring you.
most people call that marriage.
Yeah, yeah. You know, you get into marriage and then I feel like I married a child, right? And so you get, you know, like even in life, like my friends, right? It's like, oh, why are you not doing this? And so you have these friends who you're trying to have something from because you're trying to get them to feel the source of the ideal of good that you are trying to rise up to, and that's not there anymore. And so now you sort of like have to magic that, but remember the thing that you could have used to magic that was not cultivated. So you're in this weird place, and so you have to work really, really hard to reconstruct that, reanimate that creativity, that curiosity, that wonder, to get back to a place where it's sort of like churning again and it's moving, and then now you start to resonate with the world in a way that you need to. It's like you regain back your agency. But it's crazy. Hey, it's so crazy. I know I've said a bunch of stuff, and I'm gonna be quiet for a moment because it's just this like really gets me going.
No, no, I appreciate, and I do think a lot of people get married looking for, you know, the big other, someone to tell them what to do, and then, you know, and then it just becomes going on, and you never develop your own agency. And some people just have kids because that's what you're supposed to do next, right? It's always an avoiding of that agency because basically you have approached language as a correspondence theory. I'm corresponding with what's good. I better stay here because I know if I'm here, I correspond with what is good, and I don't want to lose that. It's just very interesting because, like, on some of the conversations we had, language theories of language, like what language is doing, seem to have parallels in theories of living. Like language and living seem very close together. And if there's something today about our globalized pluralistic world that has a lot to do with the ability of people to speak with one another, then we better figure out what we're exactly doing when we're speaking and what exactly language is. And I think it's increasingly clear that it's not what we think it is. Because, like, so for example, I'm also taken by the vacation vacant. That's really nice. And it's almost like we tend to go on vacation and we're vacant instead of apathetic, like ascribing to the apathetic. And that seems to be the mistake. And we become vacant when really we should be present for the apathetic. And so it's interesting to think that all of us tend to be on vacation. You know, what is like the apathetic here? Where are you? Oh, I'm on vacation. Oh, you missed out on it. So it's interesting to think that that's actually very often you do run into people and it seems like they're on vacation. They're not here, right? They're elsewhere on vacation. Bye, I'm vacant in a certain way. It's also very interesting because it should be noted that it is not always the case that you can simply tell by looking at someone, the person who's on vacation in a kind of consumeristic way and the person that's fully present, right? There's an apathetic quality that has to be there that you can sense to tell if a person is fully immersed as opposed to just being performative. But this is very interesting because it means that all acts of understanding are in reference to something that is not present. Like, so for example, I think about what you're saying with the wife example, and you're going, okay, we're talking, what's capathetic, what's present are these words. But actually, let me think about, I love this person. You're referencing something that's not there. And the context, right? And the thing that is not there is actively changing the meaning of what is there.
Yeah.
Well, that means you're not bound to the definitions. Yeah. And what it seems like is that words, it's almost like when you speak, it's like you're throwing out material, some screws here, some hammers here, some boards here. And then you say, okay, apathetic, create with that. It's almost like words are material for the apathetic more so than they are just information if you're doing it right. Because the thing is, if words are just what you're capathetically saying, since we all tend to not be that great at speaking sometimes, we skip, we're irritated, we're in huge trouble. There's something about the ability to think of language as material you're putting on the table so that then your memory or the apathetic can have something to work with. Because if you don't put anything on the table, there's nothing to work with. And really what you're doing is you're trying to create something that harkens back to the memory of the commitment. Because I think of Bergson, but this is also Plato, there's some long tradition between memory, philosophy, creation. It's almost like we've treated language for way too long outside of the context of this interplay between memory and creation. That we've treated language way too, dare I say, capathetically, way too kind of just what is said, as opposed to we are here to throw material out there that then we can refer to our memories or the apathetic and then create something with that. And then, to me, going to what you were saying with the great Zaruba, a guy, on the idea, and that, Jordan Hall was saying that relation is the opposite of ideology. Thinking about language in this creative way makes it less likely to fall into ideological traps. And when I think about it, because I need you here to create with me. Oh, and by the way, there's some apathetic thing I'm referring to create with this thing. So that's relational. I'm relating to the apathetic. I'm relating to you, and I can't reduce what we're doing to these words. There's levels upon levels of relations that help us work against ideology. And the reason ideology is problematic, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, is because of the enclosure, right? You're enclosed, you're singular, you're a point, you're algebraic versus geometric. There's something about language, if it's overly emphasizing the correspondence theory, meaning that the word cat means the animal cat. Well, it's very enclosed. It's very tight, right? And you say, well, that's great. That's why it has meaning, because it's tight. Well, there's a difference. It has meaning in a kind of deathly way, in a kind of, it has meaning, but the meaning comes at the expense of the relation. And the meaning comes and actually, in all truth, and, I was speaking with Joel about this, you don't think of the definition of the word dog when when you're speaking. Are you going through your dictionary in your head, going through all the okay, I should use this? That's not what you're doing. What you're doing is I'm using words that refer to a memory. I remember the experience of a dog. I'm pretty sure everyone in here also has similar memories. So when I say the word dog, it's going to summon that memory within you, and we're going to have intelligibility thanks to the gift of memory that then we can create with it, right? So moving toward a creative sense of language, which I'm just thinking about what Clayton was saying, we're moving away from all of these enclosure understandings of what language is doing. We're moving to something relational. We're doing something creative. And then, in my opinion, it's so much of the liminal web and democracy. And, I try to argue economic history shows that changes in how people speech is basically the secret to wealth creation following Aditra McCloskey. Oh, but it's also the creation of the oppressed subject in the Frankfurt School, according to Discourse, Kafka, Herbert Marcuse. Like the way we speak and our theories of language structure the subject and the person and makes us prone to either this enclosure that makes us vacant or makes us open in relation so that we're engaging with the apathetic. So getting a proper philosophy of language, which I think just what Clayton was saying points to, leads us in a direction of, I think, actually what is a proper way of thinking about what we're doing when we're speaking so that we think of ourselves better as a subject. And then when we get into a conversation, just as a practical note, just what Mr. Clayton was saying, when you go, wait a minute, this conversation with my wife is not just the words. There is a history that I need to refer to that is apathetically creative, that will change the meaning of these words, that will then change what's going on here. And there could be real consequences, right? You could, when you really care about someone, it only takes one bad sentence or mean thing to hurt them for years, right? So there's real stakes. There's real tensions. And so a proper understanding of what to do in language can have lifelong consequences. And if you know to refer to this memory, to this apathetic context, then you can avoid you both ending up vacant, empty in this sense. So I appreciated what Clayton was saying.
Yeah, totally. I hope you're enjoying this video so far. Just wanted to remind you, if you are interested in diving deeper in what we talk about here on the channel, in fellowship and in a more embodied way, there are a number of relevant links in the show notes, including working with me one-on-one as a client. All the information is below, including my email address. It struck me about this thing about putting way too much stress on the words and just staying in the realm of representations, basically, right? And associations, right? And then you're just trying to constantly abide by what's already known by someone or something, right? And such that you just have coherence, right? It's so funny because I had this experience with my father once, and my dad has been sober and in AA for, I don't know, a billion years, and he sponsors people and stuff like that. So he's has lots of those kinds of relationships. And we were out somewhere in public, and out of nowhere, this guy comes running up to him, and he's like, "Oh my God, Al!" My dad's name's Al. And he's like, "Al, like I lost your number. Like I've been wanting to contact you like 10 years ago. The last conversation that we had, when you said da 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 da, that fucking changed my life. Like I'm a different person now, the way I relate to my family, like the way the sun comes up, like da 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 da, like, you know, the economy's been saved, what you know, one of those stories." And so he thanks my dad, and my dad, like, you know, appreciates him, and da 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 da, and he goes away. And we're walking away, and my dad looks over at me, and he says, "He misunderstood what I said."
But it worked.
Bam.
So it's like it's like, you know, at some level, and Zaruba said something really interesting in our last conversation when I think we were talking about relation, and he was referencing somebody who had told him that like relata or something means originally to bear, right? Like relationship is to bear in some sense. And he said, he's like, and he pointed to another word that kind of meant something like that. And he said this really interesting thing. Language is trying to tell us something here, right? So even language itself, right? Even the word itself has a soul in some sense. It has a history. It has a context that even it is reaching out and speaking in things that are beyond just the literate representational thing. Even the specific word itself opens up to this other dimension. And I think that's, you know, in some sense, that story is a funny way of kind of getting to it, right? Like I can misunderstand you, right? And hear something that you didn't mean to say. In fact, you didn't say it. You said the other thing. But yet I'm hearing you, and then that ends up changing my life in ways that, like, as the speaker, I wouldn't have. I'm glad you misheard me. But it begs the question: which one was true? Actually, was it what my dad meant or what was heard? Right? Where is the truth here? See, there's a certain kind of like anonymity about truth, right? There's a certain kind of almost necessary anonymity, and this anonymity, this relationship to this anonymousness about the moment. There's always some part of it, no matter how ordinary the moment is, that is anonymous to us, right? That speaks without us knowing it's speaking. It speaks without revealing its own identity in some way, right? And in some sense, that's what I was really kind of hearing, like in when you were talking about like getting to know what your wife meant in the kitchen, right? Like there's some way that you are comporting yourself, right? And this is a strange thing to say. You're trying to hear what you didn't know. What were you already, in some sense, what was already in view, right? Such that you could begin to hear what you didn't know. But if you didn't know it, how could you know to hear it? Right? There's this, how could you even want it? And which is really interesting because I've been for the last couple of months, I've been doing this morning practice where I get up and I drink coffee, and right when the dopamine's hitting, I read this book, Meister Eckhart's, and it's really interesting. Like if you just read one, you can't read more than one. Otherwise, it kind of like you get too filled up. But if you just read one, it just lingers like a brain worm all day. Because what he's doing, he's basically taking hardcore Neoplatonic thought and he's putting in the language of a farmer, basically, right? So he's taking really concrete things, right, and then articulating this ontological level, right, and running it through. And it's so interesting because it's like it really gets in deep, especially like if you just time it right with the coffee. But one of the things he said here is he says of all the soul's power, right? He says that like he's talking about you can never know God, right? However, of the soul's powers, desire, right, is even higher than intellect. And this is really interesting to me. And he's basically said to desire God, right, will get you the closest to God, right? But it's like it's above the intellect, right, in this way. So it's like, wait a minute, like the intellect is how I kind of know things and know differences and stuff like that, right? But wait a minute. No, I can desire without knowing what, like, and that in some sense desire starts to become this kind of, what I'm hearing is this primordial way of contacting the world. But what's strange, I don't need to know what the object is. In fact, Meister is like saying, basically going like, you can't know the object that you ultimately desire, right? It's God in some sense. So I sense this in the way that you're listening to your wife and what it takes to listen to your wife and what it takes to listen to the cry and hear the different kinds of cries, right? Is that some sense there's got to be this apophatic desire, right? This apophatic desire. And I think that, like, there's also a connection here. Just another example of this is like, somebody asked me, how I got into philosophy. And I just remember like giving him an answer, and I just didn't like I was not satisfied with the answer at all. In fact, I've never been satisfied with my fucking answer about that. And then I thought to myself, I'm like, you know what? I think what it is like, it just so happens, like, call it fortunate or unfortunate. Like my curiosity is just so much bigger than my IQ, right? Like my desire, right? It's something because I desired something into it. When I opened Being in Time, which was my first fucking philosophy book, right? I didn't know what Dasein even fucking was pointing to for like 2 months, right? Like and it seems like philosophy in some way, especially reading philosophy, really in some ways you almost have to practice this particular kind of not knowing, right? But there's this relationship to what you don't know that actually draws you towards it and into it, right? And it's prior to understanding it. And as you talked about in the last conversation, Clayton, which I really appreciated, was like, but if you stick with it, eventually the understanding will start to come, right? It's not fucking linear, right? It's none of that stuff, right? But it starts to come. But it's minding this thing that keeps withdrawing. But the question is how do we know to desire that? By what do we even know to even desire that? So I want to look at this mystery, the way that Meister is talking about this, that somehow desire, right, is closer to God, right, than the intellect.
Wow, that's really beautiful, and it resonates with me. It reminds me of uh, a conversation we were having with Iris. Iris runs the Wisdom Project, and she runs a few trainings with that, and we've had lots of chats. So one particular one, she asked me. I think this was one of our very first uh, engagements. We're doing Taylor Barrett's Dialectic into Dialogos course,
Mhm.
and that was like the one he ran like a couple of years ago. And we met there and we had to go into these breakout rooms. And so we have a bit of a chat. And so she asked me these questions. She goes like, "Are you enlightened?" And I go like, "What kind of question is that?" Right? Because I go like, "Look, I don't know what even enlightenment is or what you mean by that. However, I'll tell you what I do." So if there is something that you would call like a light, what I try to do is to try and get as close as possible to it without it burning me out, and try to keep up with the light. as much as possible as I can. And so I'm not trying to become the light. I don't want, because I think I need the light to see. So I do not want to become the light,
Yeah.
but I want to use the light in the most optimal way. So I try to fly close to it so that I can get get
Yeah.
it to light what I need to see as
Yeah.
brightly as possible. And as long as it's doing that, I think I'm exactly where I need to be with it. So I don't know what you make of that, but that's how that was. So, but this desire being higher than intellect feels the same way. It's like, though in Christianity they'll talk about the right hand of God, right? In a conversation with a friend, I was asking them, but does God have, for a long time I wondered, does God have a left hand, right? Like, see, if you're going to be on the right hand, then there must be some people on the left hand, right? And it's just two hands.
Yeah.
But eventually, after meditating on it, it turns out it's not a hand per se. It's more about the optimal place to be, the right place to be. In Vivacian language, it would be like what is calling the stance, like the right stance. Because if you have the correct stance, then from that one spot, you can reach so many things. You have so many of your capabilities being unlocked. And so you can see more and you can do more, and you have more of all these virtues, lighting up in you. And so it's like there's a right place to be, and in that right place to be, you can be righteous, meaning doing more right than less, if I may call it, because we try to hold it in contention with wrong, but I don't think it has anything to do with wrong. It's more like there's right and there's more right. Like you could keep fine tuning the right and make it more optimal such that it's sharper than it used to be. And so the desire I feel is what is drawing you to that. And the reason one of the reasons seems to me that because desire in itself is a language, but it's a multifaceted language that it's happening, like desire is happening to us. We we think we make the desire, but I think we follow it. In my uh, culture, we have a saying that uh, the person you're chasing is the one who shows you where to go because they're getting away from you. So whatever it is that you're chasing uh, is going to lead you to wherever it's going. If you're a hunter and you're trying to get this animal, you have to follow it because it's leading you to where you're going. I think in a similar way, the desire draws us in this way. We don't know why we have to follow it. It's
Yeah.
it's the it, it's we're resonating with it at a level below intellect. It's like it's much below our intellect. I ask people this sometimes. I'm like, look, who people will say like, nobody told me to do this, nobody told me to do that. But then I'll ask them, who reminds you of when you need to go to the toilet? It's like nobody does. Like I just know. It's like, yeah. It's like the desire sort of has a way it will shape all of reality such that this is the most relevant reality to engage with and how to engage with it in the moment.
Yeah.
And so you you sort of have to learn to work with it. You don't, it's kind of like the weather,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
To use Daniel's terms, right? Like you have to respond to the weather and just be prepared. Have all your artifacts ready to respond to the weather, and whatever it gives you, then you may have a chance to withstand it. Otherwise, it will still happen to you. And
Yeah.
so, if we're not, and I think this is Daniel's language, where we should always be preparing, other than trying to be perfect. Trying to if you're trying to be perfect, then you're not preparing. So it's like you always have to improve your preparation because then you have the options of how to respond to wherever your desire is drawing you to. And it's always going to draw you whether you're prepared or not. If you're prepared, maybe you have a chance of responding optimally or righteously. But if you're not prepared, you will still respond,
Yeah.
but it may not turn out the way you wish.
Yeah.
And I feel like in that situation, I was referring to with my wife, I used to respond without, preparation, and without having that open awareness and without the tools that I needed. And so it would sweep me like, I really tried. Like you say this, and I remember it verbatim, right?
I
And so
resemble
that's not
everything
what,
you just said.
yeah, but that's not what I meant. So that's not what I meant. I was like, what the hell did you mean? You hear a lot of people say this, like,
Yeah.
women are impossible to understand and men are impossible to understand. You say this thing, they don't get it. I never know what they mean. And I think it's like you could apply this to children. Children are difficult to understand. People are hard to understand because if you're not listening in an open way, trying to feed in all the context, trying to follow what's going on, you're not gonna. And unfortunately, you keep falling off, like hitting off the wall, and it's just gonna be conflict after conflict, and it doesn't work. And it's like, what is it? Doing the same thing and expecting different results?
Yeah.
Yeah, this only works in exercise, not in relationship building.
Yeah. I want to
I
just
don't know
make
what
sure,
what what do you make with that? Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm grokking everything that you said. Like, so you're saying it's kind of like in some sense, can you use the analogy of if you find yourself chasing somebody or chasing something, right? It's it's guiding you, right? And what I'm hearing something very almost Heideggerian in this way, like this way where we're I think on some level probably we all have this notion of our head. There's me, there's a thing out there, and then there's this third thing that comes on, a desire. And once I have the desire, and then this me then goes towards that thing. But I think you're kind of getting more of the phenomenology of this is like the moment that I'm already underway a desire, right? But it's already begun. If I'm existing, I'm already in some sense chasing something, right? So in some sense, what you're saying, it's like the thing that's most mysterious is the thing that's on some level closer, is the most close to me. In fact, it's before me. It's primordial, right? It's primordial in some sense. Is that it? Am I hearing?
Yes, it is. It is. I think, yeah, you're hearing it correctly because it's before, it's like before the intellect.
Yeah.
It's already there. I was having a few chats with people and asking them about work, and with one person, we got to a place where we're like, oh, wait, so right from the time you are born, where you have to work to bring the air in, and it feels so terrible that you have to cry about it, because that's the only way you can respond to such a traumatic change in experience, whereby you've been breathing in fluid, now you're changing to air, like your whole biological system is being adjusted in the moment. Yes, it's like you don't need to intellectualize that. Like right from the very beginning of your, let's say, ability to experience life,
Yeah.
the desires have been there and they have continuously shaped. And and I guess that's where the people who make the argument about there not being a free will come from. Though I think like it's not just about that, like that's a whole different line of thought. But I think that's one of the motivations. It's like there has always been a certain shape uh, that you show up in, and that shape is already constraining what you're going to desire
Yeah.
and how you're going to respond to the desire and which desires you're going to respond to and which ones you're not.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Mr.
Uh,
Gross.
no, it's outstanding. And I don't know about you guys. I got into philosophy for the t-shirts. Is that not what you guys got in for? The t-shirt? Oh, well, shoot. And I would have loved to have seen the face of that librarian when he first was like, I'm starting philosophy. This book will do. Pulls off Being in Time. And the like, okay, have a good time. I would love to have been there. I really like so much. That was just outstanding. It is interesting in conversation where you feel like you're chasing something, right? And the way to go is the chasing. And it's also very interesting in conversation. Usually, like when you come into these, you don't know exactly what you're going to talk about, but then you sense it and you chase it. And then the more you chase it, the more you desire to chase it. And it's just very interesting that the structure of a good conversation is this kind of falling into place, if you will. Also, it's interesting with freedom, because when you're chasing something, it's kind of freeing. It's like you feel free. And when you're chasing something you desire, you feel free both because you're free to chase what you desire. But actually, there's also a freedom in knowing what to do. There's a kind of freedom in limitation. When you could do anything, it's actually not freeing. Yeah. It's when I have a desire, I know I'm free from not knowing what to do, and I want to chase it. And it's liberating in that I'm free from this not being over either, right? Like there's also a loss of freedom in completing something because now it's over. You've lost this thing that was a source of your freedom, right? So what's very interesting is that in order for freedom to be freedom, there's actually like multi-dimension. There's like a few freedoms that actually have to be at play all at the same time, all at once. The freedom to, the freedom to chase the thing you desire, the freedom from not knowing what to chase, and the freedom of the continuation that is going on. And it's interesting how in like a dialogos, you have those three kind of freedoms that are in occupation, and it's like the emergent result of it is a kind of feeling of losing yourself in, that you lose yourself in. Well, that right there is more of a language of desire than intellect, because if I were to ask you, where are you right now? I don't know. You don't know, right? And likewise, do you know what you're saying? I don't know until I do, and then it's like I could have said nothing else. Like the very structure of conversation speaks to Master Eckhart. It speaks to this in the same way that we, I guess in Orthodoxy, they'll say we do not know God's essence, we know his effects. Matthew Allison was making that point, right? So likewise, if you ask, what is the essence of a conversation like this? We don't know, but we know the effects. What is the subject of the conversation? We don't know, but we know by its effects. Like it's very interesting. You have very real knowledge by the effects, and the very fact that the essence is kind of apophatic and kept from you is precisely why it's freeing. In the same way that if you could know the essence of God, you'd be dead, right? Because you'd be overwhelmed and destroyed, or you would be God, right? So, if you're not God, then that right there means you're in relation to God, and you know it by the effects. The other image I was getting in mind that, it just makes me think, so with this idea of desire over intellect, chasing, it's almost like in conversation, and it should also be noted, psychoanalytically, language and desire are strongly tied together. Speaking creates desire, even if you don't know what you're talking about. And so you don't have the object, and I would argue actually often when you speak, you don't know if your words equal and correspond to the thing you're speaking with, but you sense the movement, you sense the desire. Well, psychoanalytic, whether we're talking to Freud or Lacan, they're all like, hey, language and desire are strongly tied together. And desire is after an object that if it gets, it dies. So you have to learn to keep desire from its object so that desire is in fact desiring. Well, that sounds like staying in the effects versus getting to the essence. That sounds like keeping the conversation going, right? So there's a psychoanalytical background to all of this. But what it's almost like too, is I'm thinking of the forms in Plato, which I think we've had a correspondence theory of forms. Oh, this is the cup. Let me find the form cup, and then they'll correspond. They'll match, right? When really, like we've talked about before, I think the forms are more like formulations, more like the orbits of planets. And the other image I'm getting in mind, just listening to Clayton and you speak, is this kind of like in a bowling alley where you have gutters, and the ball falls in, and then it follows something. It's almost like in conversation, it's almost like all around you, there are these gutters, if you will, or maybe ridges or kind of forms. And when you're speaking, you're pushing one another around, kind of like the apathetic walking stick of Clayton, that you're feeling around. And then you feel, oh, we found a gutter. We're following now. Oh, we're going somewhere. The desire is kindling. And it's almost like when you're speaking, it's almost like this feeling around, pushing one another around to find the kind of rut, to find the gutter. Gutter is a negative term. I'm trying to think of a better one, but the path, the form, and then, oh, there we go. Yay, there we go. Because isn't it? Because, and it seems tied to speaking, because think about all these people that said, one time my English teacher told me that they liked my story, and that's when I knew I wanted to be a writer. That's crazy. It's almost like you were pushed into a gutter. You were pushed into a, yay, I found it. You know, because I bet you also, what's funny is it also seems relative to natures and individuals, because your science teacher probably also told you at some point you were good at the experiment, but you don't remember that. There are certain things you remember or that kindle your desire and you don't even know why. And then you feel like you've found the form. You feel like you found the gutter. And I think what conversation is a movement around of desire until you find those apathetic gutters, those apathetic forms. And that's what we're doing when we're speaking, more so than corresponding information. And the very act of, and then I'll pass it on, and then the very act of speaking has this kindling of desire that occurs by the speaking itself, that doesn't need the intellect, because speaking, the word, how did God create? God spoke into existence. Speaking axiomatically creates desire that operates without correspondence, without an object. And that desire is then what is pushing us into the forms that when we find them, then it's, you know, you're chasing. I had to make the wee noise. My children would have really liked that. And that seems, it's like in the beginning was the word you speak, the effects pushed into it, and it's following, and now you're chasing. Now you're free and different things. So it's as if in a conversation, that's more so what's going on. Not just finding, oh, because you don't know what you're talking about. It is way more like Master Eckhart is saying, you don't know what you're talking about, but you desire it. And you know it in the sense of the intimate, you know it in terms of intimacy. Like there is knowing and desire. You know your wife, right? There's knowing and love. But that is the kind of knowing that's going on in conversation, not the intellectual knowing, the knowing of desire that is a following of effects, that is the feeling out those forms that are moving you around. So I appreciate everything that's been said.
Wow. So there's it's interesting. This I'm kind of sitting with this sense that you speak, right? What I heard you say is like, so the desire is what you speak out of, right? And in a conversation, I like what you said. It's like we're feeling around, and like, you know, not all my speaking says something. They always say it's, you know, how I like how Ivo de Janeiro puts it. He's like, to speak is always an attempt to say something, and we say attempt, right? Because we don't always say it, right? So there's this other part of conversation where you're right. It's kind of like this, you're shooting this cannon, right? Like, and it's usually, there's always going to be some noise versus signal part of it. And that somehow my desire, right? And this is also where it gets specific. What I want to include in here somehow is like, where's the listening? What is the role of the listening in this, right? Like, because in some sense, my desire, I may not even know. In fact, I probably don't know what I desire, but it's the movement of speech. It's in some sense, it's calling to it. And then I know when but here's the question is, how do I know when I said it, when I actually spoke and it said? On some level, there's a lighting up. There's something satisfying about it. There's something, it's almost like I'm discovering what I desire. Like I'm getting a little piece, right, of the mystery of what I desired, but I didn't know. And when I speak it, I then know it. And this is something interesting too, as well, about like, I've thought a lot about this, of that, you know, to be in a place with technology where we've uncollapsed almost completely, right? The ability to connect from the ability to relate. They used to be like this, right? If we had to connect, we had to at least talk on the phone, right? And now I have an icon out there that's like has opinions and is saying stuff, right? That I don't even need to know about, right? Like it's so weird. I don't even know what to think of that. So but but in but there's this way where I think that, and especially if you have kids, you know this intimately. Like they have no fucking notion of themselves. My kid is just starting to stabilize when he looks in the mirror that it's him, right? On some level, right? But he doesn't always remember it, that it's him. It's like this moving target. So by the time he says I, his own attention folds back on itself, and he says I for the first genuine time. That's that I has literally been given to him in this inner subjective pool that he's been swimming in, right? And the adequacies and the inadequacies of that are going to directly show up, right? As psychology is so apt to show us, all the dysfunctions in that relationship is going to show up in the contortions of this, what I call I, right? And then seek to like resolve in 12 marriages, and the 13th one is when I realize it may not be them. but this, so in some way there's this really interesting thing, and I think Christianity like really emphasizes this to, and it's different when they talk about the difference between an individual and to be a person. How does one become a person, right? Like a person for in Christianity is that it has a sense that you are by definition beyond yourself, right? Like so you actually don't quite know who you are until you speak. And if you I know this, like probably the like example of this. Oftentimes, I remember when I was like single and going to school, like I would walk in, I'd wake up, have my coffee, whatever, not talk to anybody, and then I get into school, and like the first person I respond to, I'll be like, I fucking hate you in my mind. I'll be like, oh shit, I'm in a bad mood. I had no idea I was in a bad mood until the moment I talked to somebody, right? The moment I interacted, I was like, I got a sense of like who I was and where I was and how I felt, right? And there is this way where it's like the who we are in some deep, profound way is I think continually coming to be in interrelation. And so there's that mystery in there, and then there's this other part where it's the role of listening, right? The role of listening and speaking. I mean, listening to me is like this. I've been thinking about listening for 30 fucking years, and I feel like I still don't. There's something about listening that I don't quite have the words about, that's profound, that I don't totally understand, but it's so somehow listening is like so powerful in all of this.
It's so powerful, the listening aspect. You remind me of going back to the wife scenario, the way, like, after I meditated upon it for some time, what I sort of like, I coined the phrase hearing with the heart.
Mm.
It's kind of like, oh yeah, this the Zoom thing is happening again. Yeah, but it's like hearing with the heart. It's like you have to listen for the meaning. And so it's like you have to listen uh, for their desire in a way, like going back to desire. It's like they must have a desire they're trying to express. It's almost like it has like a spiritual quality in a way. And for you to start to hear that, you have to sort of like expand the context
Mm.
and sort of like connect what is there with the apophatic, like everything that's not there, and sort of color in the whole picture. And then you may get a glimpse
Mm.
of what it means, right?
Mm.
Even then, it's like even when you do all that, you're not going to get it all. And you're going to get a piece of it.
Yeah.
And using like the circling method, it's like if you play it back and present back what you managed to mind, it's like, yeah, I've been listening, but this is what I heard. I heard this, and it seems like you mean this, and this is the sense I'm making from it. Am I getting it?
Yeah.
And and every time I've made this offer to anybody I've interacted with, they love it. They're willing to correct you. Like
Yeah.
they wish you could do this for them, but they don't know how to ask for it.
Yeah.
I ran this experiment with my friend. I was telling him, like, it's sort of like we all experience reality, but through our own filter of our own experience, right? Like, our own experiences, our own desires, they all color the reality we get to experience. But for us to relate, to have that shared point of contact, as Daniel would say, we need to manually align it. It's not going to auto happen. So we have to reveal ourselves. It's more like, I know you said a bunch of stuff, but this is what I heard, and this is what I think it means.
Yeah.
Am I getting you?
Yeah.
And the moment I'm not being God, and I've been invited to offer my opinion on how I'm being received, I would definitely be willing to clarify it, because now I have something to work with.
Yeah.
But if I have nothing to work with, and my reality is being dismissed, I think then we fall back to the gaslighting. Then I feel like they're saying I'm not real. I'm not even here. No, I have to fight for my reality. I am real. And so you feel the need to over-express and defend that reality and hold the flag for it, because how dare they, right? Like it has to be real. You feel it. It's real to you. And so I think coming at it in this open, friendly way, whereby we're not dismissing our assumptions, we're not dismissing our experience, but holding both of them in contention. But to describe it in a way, like, to hold a space for both realities, right? It's like, I have a reality here and you have a reality. What happens if we put them in contention? Do they align? Do they not align? And if they're not aligning, how can we make them align? Or how can we keep them next to each other without them both having to dissolve for just one, right? And so through that revelation and a negotiation of where we can have some similarities, where we can connect, I think then we start to have that shared point of contact, and then we're now open to communing. Then we can fall out of the tyranny of language and start to actually get to resonating with the meanings that we're trying to transmit. And it's in that moment that, a shared desire happens, and then we can both chase it and learn from it as much as we need to, as opposed to just be fighting about what are the meanings, what are definitions, what do you really mean by that word, right? Like, I think the dictionary says this. The dictionary has like about 17 different meanings of it. And so if we go there, we're definitely going to be stuck. But if we amplify and help each other, like paint out what we think is being met and what is being shared, I feel like that brings us closer and closer to each other. And then there's a chance for real relation. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
There was so many tremendous things have been said. It is very interesting, the experience of listening, because like when I feel like listening is when I end up surprised by myself. Like there's this weird thing that's possible when I listen. I can't really surprise myself except in the place of listening. Like, so for example, the whole bowling hour gutter thing. I have no idea, guy was talking, Clayton was talking, and suddenly I saw bowling gutters in the air. That was surprising. No idea where that came from. And then it associated with book 7 forms, relation, boom, boom, boom. Like this, listening is an experience of being surprised for me. Like it feels like I'm surprised. Why are there? Oh wow! It's like chasing bowling gutter forms. Oh, it's like in conversation, apathetic walking stick pushed in. Wow, surprising. And it's as if and what's interesting when listening is this opportunity to be surprised by yourself, by what appears and what you say. is that then it's 100% a point of contact with the other person. Like it's like you must be making contact with that person because they are making things appear in you or manifest that you never did and you never thought, but they are related to the books you've read and the conversations you've had. So there's this fascinating combination in the act of listening of you have material, just like we were saying, words, there's material here and there's an apathetic thing that you're giving it over to that then it creates with it, right? We were saying that at the beginning, like the memory of the commitment chase. In the act of listening is as if you're giving over everything that's in you to what the person is saying to create with it, and then you're surprised.
Yeah.
And then you're surprised. And then I think this is kind of, and also too, I think if like two people in conversation are constantly like experience it as surprise, then then it's much easier to be humble because you're like, I have no control over this. So I can't hold that over you, honey. You can't hold it over me. There's a lot of surprising going on. And you go into it looking, I was speaking with Matthew Allison and we were talking about how in the Bible, a lot of times when a miracle happens, they don't go, why is this happening? They say, how is this happening? It's like, how is this happening? And it's almost like a good conversation is where you go, how is this happening? And when you're listening, you have an experience of how is this happening? You know, why can actually be a dangerous question because it's deconstructive. Why is this happening? And it's almost aggressive. But when you say, how is this happening? You are asking for a why, like what is the mechanism, but it's also all. There's an all in the how, right? Like, it's like, how is this happening? It's like, I want to know how it's happening, but wow, this is happening. And that inherently means you have a point of contact with what's going on. Why can be like, why is this happening? No relation, right? But how is asking the why plus all, if you do it in this biblical way. You can, of course, use the pragmatic how when you're being deconstructed, but there's a, how will this be, Lord? How me? How could this be? And it's what's interesting too is Matthew Allison was connecting that with that crazy moment in Minnow where the slave, he's like, come over here. And he remembers he can do math, right? He's like, how? He's like, how are you doing math, slave? Right? It's like, how is it? He's like, well, it all must be memory, right? And the point that Allison was getting at is the slave goes back and knows that they have contact with the infinite. Like forever forth, they have to know the infinite is inside of them and they'll never hold that plate the same way again, right? All of reality now has a different quality because the way Matthew was describing, he called it the elastic experience of, it was something like, oh, I'm so sorry, Matthew, I should get this phrase. It was such a good phrase. This kind of elastic experience of the infinite where you're pulled by the infinite, pulled, and then release, snap back, right? And that's how a conversation is pull, snap back. And then forever forth, you know you can do that, right? There's something about listening that has this point of contact with the infinite that also necessitates the point of contact with the person you're speaking of because you're surprising yourself and they must be contacting with you because it's kind of like not possible to surprise yourself, right? Like how do you surprise yourself? By definition, you can't do that. And yet you do that when you listen. Once you have this experience of yourself, I think this is really tied to the meaning crisis because once you know you have this contact with the infinite that comes out correctly in the posture of listening, that feels like desire is pushed into a kind of apathetic groove, you know you're the kind of subject that can do that. And now life has meaning. It's full of these grooves. It's full of these gutters. It's full of these contacts with the infinite. And then it's just up to you to decide where you take that meaning. You're going to take it into business. You're going to take it into writing. You're going to take it into different things. Like the meaning, like you can get in a conversation in a point of contact with the apathetic and then remember that, bring that to everything. And then it's like Clayton was saying with his wife, when you're talking with your wife, you remember the commitment. Likewise, when you're going through life and you're like, oh my gosh, I hate this job, you can remember the contact with the infinite that you had in those conversations and change the meaning of this boring day and change the meaning of this difficult thing or change the meaning of what you're capable of, maybe to get a different job or to face your fears or to do all these different things. Those points of contact where you surprise yourself and you go, wow, I can actually surprise myself. Well, then maybe you can surprise yourself with the courage to do that thing you've always been afraid to do. Or you can surprise yourself with the courage, to actually, listen, because you're willing to be those surprised. So it's fascinating to me, and then I'll pass it on, that the experience of listening is an experience of being surprised by yourself, which then you remember you're capable of that, and you can then have that memory be the context of everything you go through in all of life to change the meaning of it, just like Clayton's conversation with his wife. You're changing the meaning by referring to something that's more apathetic.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing in that is that basically in those moments of listening, that surprise, the self part, right, is in some sense, it's interesting that that particular self that you are surprised by. I think it's surprising is that you, in some sense, you'll return to yourself, right, in the moment of listening in a way that you're more open than the previous shape that you took, right? Your memories of you, right? Your self-representation doesn't hold, right? And in this kind of way, right? In fact, there is an ecstaticness, right? Usually a moment, like an epiphany, which is really interesting thing about listening, because now I've tried for literally 25 years to teach someone how to listen. Like I have year-long courses and trainings and 3 levels of them, right? Essentially, right, which the ground of circling is all in listening, right? But and I'm not going to stop trying, but like if I were to have to call it here, can I say that I've ever taught anyone how to listen? I don't think so, because I don't know. I think you can teach someone how to hear, right? But I don't think you can teach someone how to listen. Listen is this strange thing that it's more like it's an existential finding oneself listening, right? It's something that happens, right? Listening happens, right? But it's never like, I can't ever tell you the moment of like, okay, all right, I'm not listening now. I'm not listening now. Okay, I want to listen now. Okay, I'm starting to listen now. Okay, now I'm really listening. Da, 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 da. No, there's this, I find myself having already being in the midst of listening or having heard, but there's this, it's not exactly in me, right? It's not exactly in you, right? And it's not just between, there's something else that goes on there. And I'm wondering about this sense, and this maybe is where it brings it back to like mystery and desire. Because there's another thing that Mr. Meister says, Eckhart says, that's really struck me ever since he said this, where I think he was talking about the soul and the soul's, what is it that, I think it's something like, what is it that how does, if the soul and God are in some sense, you like her true home is in unity with God, right? How does she ever desire God or herself? And he says, and he kind of does this thing, this move where he says, it's because the soul's in some sense is imprinted with the knowledge that she is, without knowing what she is. Think about that. Like she's given is kind of like encoded with, she implicitly knows that she is, or that God is, right? Without knowing what she is, right? It's this place where like that, knowing that versus knowing what. And it's interesting because when I think about when I hear something, right? I don't always like understand what I'm hearing but to hear it. It's like, in fact, if I go to say back what I've heard, if I've really heard it, it's almost like trying to communicate an insight, right? It's like, it doesn't come with a bunch of words and representations. I have to translate it somehow. And that translation will probably be filled with all kinds of noise, right? A little bit of signal, right? I'll never be satisfied with what I just heard. but I'm wondering if that there's this way where, because if you think about listening in acoustical space, like I can, okay, in seeing, first of all, seeing, seeing only sees surfaces. Right? Therefore, if I stay in seeing, I have to do a lot of explaining, right? Because I have to explain the interiority, right, of what's seen. Because all seeing sees is a surface, therefore I have to draw out all these kinds of things. And it's in just visual space, it's really easy to be a Cartesian Newtonian Nazi, right? Because it really does look like, no, that thing's standing still and now it's moving, right? And now it's not moving, and now that thing's reacting to that thing. And you could just have the whole thing laid out in visual space. And it's interesting too, because even the horizon, I can see the horizon. I can see that I don't see beyond the horizon. I could somehow be attracted or drawn in by what's beyond the horizon without seeing it, right? But I can't know what's beyond the horizon, right? By definition, because it's beyond the horizon. But here's the thing with hearing and perhaps listening is like I can hear what's beyond the horizon, right?
Mm.
I can hear what's beyond the horizon. And the other thing about acoustical space um is in sound, right? Whereas seeing just sees the surface of things, and listening, if I just I could tap on the wood, the sound reveals its interiority, right? It's like its resonance, right? Its resonance, right? Displays its interiority in some sense, right? So there's something about hearing and listening in acoustical space, right? That is really key here. Okay, that's another point. I'm afraid I'm gonna all these threads that came up when both of you are talking are way more than I can handle. But like I'm gonna help you. I'm gonna have you not handle it with me. So the other thing too is the thing I've no is this, and again, here's thought, right? Thought, desire, mystery, right? Listening, right? Listening not being this thing that I can actually do, it's this thing that happens, right? Um, it gives back to me, right? When I hear, I am surprised by myself. In other words, I'm returned to myself in a way that's beyond what I had previously represented in some sense. Um, and now here's this thing about thought, like the phenomenology of listening is really interesting, because I'm sure at some point, right, if you're listening to me and something strikes you, and then you start thinking about the thing that struck you, and you're like, oh yeah, that's really good. I was just thinking about this the other day, and da, 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 right? Like, somewhere between like 30 seconds and 5 years later, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I stopped listening. There's this interesting thing. It's like this interesting thing about it's almost impossible for me to listen and think at the same time. Where hearing, like I can actually hear and think at the same time, right? But I can't really listen and think at the same time. So there's this deep coupling with whatever it is that listens and whatever it is that.
Oh no! Did we lose him? God!
Uh-oh.
Oh, there you are. There you are.
Yeah.
We were hearing and thinking at the same time. So you
Yes.
cut us. So now he's back.
Yeah. This so there's something about like where it's interesting when you think about what thought, like this, to listen in some sense is a giving, to the degree that I'm listening, is whatever it is that thinks, I in some sense give to you in some way, and I my listening affords you to think me, right? Because it's like thinking, like listening and understanding are wedded here too, right? And this is one of the ways where I think maybe something like, in the Eastern traditions where you have this notion of transmission, right? Where you sit around somebody and you just listen to somebody talk and like you don't know exactly how you end up learning it, but it just feels like it transmitted over to you. In this way, right? If you think about some thoughts, for me to think them, right, requires me to explode presuppositions that I have and stand on presuppositions that I don't have to really think some thoughts, right? Requires me to be someone else in some way. So there's this way where, in some sense, like if you think about how we become people, right? There's this way that like to listen to some thoughts, right? I, in some sense, has the possibility of transforming me. So to really give over my whatever it is that thinks, to give to you to think my thoughts for me, or think your thoughts, right? In some sense. Now we're starting to talk about like this seems to be very, very intimate and very creative in this way.
Yeah, it's very resonant. That thing you said there about listening affords you to think. I wrote it down. That's why I'm reading it.
Yeah.
I couldn't listen it and hear you at the same time. So I had to write it so I can come back and hear. Uh, but yes, it it's something else. That's how I would describe it. It's the listening. The listening emerges through the hearing, and like what I was describing before. It's when you have that shared point of contact, people will say something like, "I feel hard," or "You heard me," and I think what they're trying to say is that they feel that whatever thought they were trying to express has been listened to. And it's not just a mere being heard, it was processed in a way that's resonant to the expression they were trying to put across,
Mm.
right? Um, the other day I was having this back and forth, WhatsApp chat with a friend, and I was sort of like playing with the question of what work means. And so we go back and forth, and I play back to them what they were saying, and I keep amplifying. And about 7 exchanges in, they respond like, "Are you trying to get inside my head?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am trying to get
Yeah.
inside your
Yes.
head. You caught on to me because that's exactly what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
So I could see what it's like in there.
Yeah.
But them making that statement was so profound to me because I was like, wow, they got it. They got
Yeah.
what I was trying to do
Yeah.
without me having to articulate or reveal myself.
Yeah.
But through the interaction, they caught on to me. That like they felt the resonance happening and sort of starting to align, and that's what the listening gave them to me. To give them to them was they're getting inside my head. It's like they're merging with me. The thoughts are merging, which is sort of what you're trying to describe there. The listening affords you to think me, and
Yeah.
it's such
Yeah.
a brilliant phrase, and it's not choiceful. It's more emergent. It feels like it's more emergent. And it's, I think, what you have to wait for to happen. Like when even you're trying to resonate with a difficult philosophical text. I feel like even through all of experience, and don't get me wrong, like there's going to be propositional communication that is pretty instant clear. It's like it doesn't have that level of depth that requires for a listening to emerge, right? Um, but as we've described, like, depending on how layered whatever is on offer is, uh, some things are going to be instant, and for some things, you have to be patient for it to decompress and the listening to emerge, which is the example of the guy who chased down your dad and
Yeah.
then reminds him of something from 10 years ago, which turns out is not exactly what was articulated.
Yeah.
However, it led to this whole wonderful,
Yeah.
better that turned out to something
Yes.
different on the other side. And
Yeah.
so for me, that deeply resonates with me. Like, it's so apt. And I'm so appreciative of this phrase, the listening that affords you to think me. I'm left with that. I'll pass it to you, Daniel.
No, I think it's magnificent. Well, a few things come to mind. It's very interesting. The analyst in psychoanalysis will say, when you're in the clinic, it's very important to identify if you're supposed to be listening for effect or meaning. And a lot of times they make the mistake of missing the effect that the person is trying to communicate, the emotion, because they're too bent on the meaning. So I was thinking about knowing, very often the analyst is actually listening more to the effects than the meaning. And I think that actually is something that people, in order to listen as well, it's almost like the person speaking needs to be not overly bent on the meaning. Like they have to communicate an effect as well. And then that strikes you. You hear, that thing you don't even understand, but it hits you because an effect is communicated, not merely information. The other thing, on this idea of thinking the other, and I love that phrase as well. It makes me think you don't, basically critical thinking, in my opinion, is empathy, because empathy is not putting your shoes in another person's shoes. It's putting your feet in another person's shoes, where you literally try to think of the world through their lens. If you are not doing that, then you must just be thinking hard through your lens. Very often we define critical thinking as just thinking hard or rigorously through your own framework. That's critical thinking. No, critical thinking would be to be a quote unquote movie critic of the way that your thinking structures reality towards you. And that would require you to think from another person's point of view, because otherwise you can't see the water you're in, per se, like that fish in the Wallace example, right? So there's something about the inability to really think unless you can think the other who's able to think you outside of yourself. And if you can't do that, you're enclosed, so you're not thinking. Real thinking is not enclosed. That's just ideology. Real thinking is relational. So critical thinking requires something like empathy, because that's the only way you can become a thought critic, like a movie critic, of the way that your thinking is structuring reality. And it would seem, though, here's the thing, empathy would almost have to, though, entail.
No.
Think like Clayton thinking about me, well, then I'm just going to absorb that into how I'm thinking, and it's going to be performative, right? It's not going to be actual empathy. There is something about actual empathy that requires the surprise. You can't plan it. It just has to happen. And now you're thinking of yourself, and you're thinking in a way you've never thought it before, because you're listening to the other, so you can be surprised by what comes out of you. That then is something that was not captured by your preset thinking. So there's something about empathy and surprise that is tied together. And unless you're engaged in empathy, you're not engaged in real thinking. You're not engaged in critical thinking. You're just thinking through your structure. And I think what's interesting about this then is the other thing, when Guy, you were saying we do this thing of the we want to represent ourselves, and that's a problem. Correspond, as opposed to be surprised, and you snap back in and you're a different self, like we were saying with Menno. Well, it's almost like in the same way that we don't know God by his essence, but by his effects. We actually don't know ourselves except by the effects. We never know our essence. We only know our effects. Oh, and by the way, I need you guys to have effects. I can't have effects without you guys, because I can't have those surprises. The surprising are the effects by which I can know myself. I can't know my essence because that's ultimately beyond me. And there's also a sense in which, I'd have to think about this. There's a sense in which only like God can have an essence because God is being, where everything else can't have a standalone essence. We can only have an essence in so much as we participate and point to God's essence, right? So if we try to know ourselves according to an essence as opposed to effects, that could be a problem. And we're made in the image and likeness of God, so it would make sense. If you can only know God by his effects, then you can only know yourself by your effects. But it's inherently communal because the effects by which you are the things that surprise you, that are only possible in relation with other people. And so you need others to have the effects of yourself by which you can know yourself, and there's no other way without falling into idolatry. All other ways of knowing yourself would require the reification of an essence that is able to be the ground of its own being without the essence of God. Well, what's that called? An idol. Idolatry is believing a thing can be the ground of its own being, right? Like Owen Barfield will talk about that. That's why he says, he's funny because Owen Barfield warns that things are idols. He's all about relations because the moment I say that bookcase is a thing, if I'm not careful, I'm treating it as if it exists on its own. Well, what's the only being that can exist on its own? God. Only God can be its own existence. So if I'm not careful, speaking about things is a form of idolatry, right? Well, how do we have a problem? How do you not think about things? Because the moment you plan to not think about things, you're going to do it according to your own thing, per se, your own structure of understanding, right? You have to be surprised. You have, the only way to know things is by surprises, because it is only when you're surprised that effects come forth by which you know your thing and yourself in relation to that thing you're talking about. So you have to talk about things and think about things in relations so that you undergo surprises by which then the subjects of your discussion are in the context of effects that are surprising and therefore not reducible to preset ideas. Thus, they're more likely to be empathetic, thus more likely to be actual critical thinking, and thus actual thinking. So if you don't have this surprise structure that only seems possible in a conversational setting, then you can't think anything, because you can't think things according to the thinking of desire, which is intimately, and knowing you can only think it according to understanding, which is then one-sided, as Hegel would put it, which means it's an idol. It's a thing, not a surprise. And so there's something about this knowing that happens in relation that allows effects of everyone in the conversation to come out, without which they can't know themselves and they can't even know the things that are being discussed, because they're not able to bring that other in the way that Guy was talking about, that Clayton was bringing out as well. So it's almost like all of this is a testament to the fact that we know ourselves by effects, not by essence. And that is in relation to the effects of God that point to his essence. And we only have essence to the degree we participate in that trajectory according to God's effects. I pass it on.
Well, I'm just getting the sense of, as it's coming to me now, is just the sense of, in terms of listening, it feels less, it feels less like something I'm doing to you, or something being done to you, right? Or you doing it to me. In some sense, it's, I think, something we both are participating in, right? It seems, what is that Vervaeke term? The transsubjective, or how does he put that? Yeah, transjective. Yeah, transjective.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes it is really like in circling, this always happens. It's people feel deeply heard. It's never when you actually get what they just said. It's when you get in some sense deeper than what they could say, right? Is when they go, oh, I feel deeply seen or deeply gotten or deeply heard. And I think this maybe has something to do with this way that this relationship that's kind of, in some sense we've been talking about throughout, this difference between context and content, right? Whereas we could say like idle talk, right, is really, it's really simply like most idle talk is just simply like hovering around content.
Yeah.
Like I've already decided and you've already decided we know what a vacuum cleaner is, right? And like based on that, I'm going to spend 3 hours giving you the opinions about and my aversions and like why they don't have this vacuum cleaner forever, right? And it's mired in the content. But it seems like a conversation goes deeper when it starts to address what is it that even grants the togetherness of all that content in the first place, right? It's that hearing, it's that minding, right, where the background becomes the foreground in some sense. That is when you have an experience, right, of depth that comes on. And how like in the circling facilitator training, the art of circling, how we try to get at this is I'll go up to the board and like I'll write down a bunch of like what seem to be really random words, right? Like lipstick, um, uh, sports cars, sex, fire trucks, uh, stop, da, 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 right? And then I'll just like put them up there and I go, okay, so who wants to guess? Who wants to guess the context of all this, right? And it's eventually someone says red, right? But at first you're like, there's this whole kind of confusion. But the moment you get red, right? Like then I draw this little line over that and everyone gets that experience red. Okay, but now red has become the content. What's the context of red, right? When we go, well, light spectrum, right? And we go, okay, then now that becomes content, background, foreground. What's the context of light spectrum? Well, light, right? Okay, go back. And then what's the context of light? Now we're starting to like hit the apophatic, right? So in some senses, moving towards context, by definition, right, is moving closer and closer to the apophatic, right? Because eventually we're going to hit a mystery. In fact, you can just basically start with anything in the foreground. And if you go back further enough, you're going to hit mystery at a certain point. But here's what's interesting is that when I go on that ride, right, in a conversation, right, or even if a life situation has me go on that ride, right, there's nothing like, struggling with starting a business and all the fucking things that you got to do and like all the like obstacles that it's a real relationship, right? Like any project that you take on that when you promise to do it, you're not currently capable of doing it, right? Like you're entering into a self-revealing transformative process, right? So in some sense, you're continually coming to realize these kind of greater contexts, right? When you confront resistance and go through these character building struggles in relationships. But when you do that, when you go up and you touch the mystery, and then you come back to the content that you're originally talking about, it transforms, right? And it's a strange way. It's a strange thing where it's like, the deeper into the background that you go when you start from the foreground. And I think it's really important to start from real life, right? This is just why it's really important to not have kids, right, go into abstract thinking too early in some sense, right? Like because we want because then abstraction. Well, it's like it's funny. It's this thing about there's all this press about how amazing the frontal lobes are, right? But actually, the frontal lobes aren't the thing. It's our hands. Our hands grew these, and specifically our thumbs. Once our thumbs can start to get a grip, then these things grew, right? It's like it's out of being able to grip and to manipulate and to relate and reach into the world and to do all these different kinds of things is when we started to grow frontal lobes out of our more complex relationship with the world, right? And so, like, really the amazing things are these things. It's not so much this thing is just this thing is in some sense, like, if anything, is on some level a trying to replicate this. And I think there's a real key lesson here in that it's strange. The more you want to know the specific of something and in its concreteness, in its situatedness, and its facticity, right? Paradoxically, right? Of course, in its infinite way that it's always withdrawing, right? Has one draw into greater abstractions. But in order to see this, right? And then the abstraction, right, is in contour with this, and they're not confused, right? Because the abstraction is being drawn out of the necessity of the world in that moment. So it directly is comported to the world, right? And has you see it deeper, which allows you to make even deeper abstractions that allow you to see it, right? This sense about this mystery, this just more about I guess the discipline of the mystery.
Yeah. Wow, so much there. I want to like play on what you've touched on there at the end. The point of contact of the mystery that we experience through abstraction, right? Um, it's as if like mystery hits us and we can't process all of it. So we take the functional aspect of this mystery and apply it. So then that becomes the way we thingify that, kind of what Daniel was touching on before. It's like we idolize it in this function that it made possible when it hit us.
Mm.
However, then we get trapped there, right? Because if you're a child and you're being taught the meaning of words,
Yeah,
you just know there's only one kind of book. What are you talking about? Like, there's a book. This is a book, and that's all a book is. It's only until later, of course, that you get to discover that, oh, there's so many different aspects of book, and even in those aspects, all those manifestations of book, we're still not yet there. Like, we can't get to the bottom of book.
yeah.
So we have to live in contention with that fact that we'll never get to the bottom of book, and we still have to hold all these various abstractions of book that we have to work with, and we should be okay with this. But that can be, like, in a way, like, if you're still trying to figure out the boundaries within which to operate, this can be anxiety provoking because it's too much. It's too much to handle. You still need all the building blocks in place, right? And so the compression mechanism, the abstraction is just helping us to relate, like,
Yeah.
just get closer with the mystery. However, I feel like, one role as parents that we have is to sort of like not solidify the mystery. It's like, hey, child, this is a book, but there's more to book than you may ever know. So just start here, right? And I think we have to actively do that so that we can maintain that door open to mystery. The problem starts to happen if we solidify that is book, that's all there is to book, there's nothing else. And then, 12, 15 years later, the question starts, but dad, you told me this was book.
Yeah.
I have discovered so many instantiations of book. You lied to me. Like, no, child, I didn't mean to lie to you. I could only articulate that much at the moment. But then it means that I wasn't, how do I call it? Like I wasn't as this strong figure of dad that I wanted to be when I did that. So I have to undermine that strong figure that I wanted to project myself as, and sort of like uh, acknowledge my limits in the process. It's like I can't articulate all of it. I can try, but in a humbling way, and sort of like accept that. Uh, but it's difficult when you're trying to set structure and also present yourself as not knowing it. You spoke about, when we try to project, to start projects. I'm currently starting a project, trying also to set up my own podcast platform and just have more of these kinds of conversation. And I'll give you like a couple of instances that you reminded me of from there. Conversations, where we just jump on, kind of like we did, and we just go. Many of those are great, right? Like there's lots of these. Having that kind of conversation is great, but this is not the typical kind of conversation. The other one that is interview like, whereby the topic is predefined. There's questions, there's provocation, there's lots of performative entertainment in action. That is more what most people are used to. And so when I reach out to people and I'm like, hey, come on my channel, let's have a conversation. And he was like, what is it going to be about? I was like, well, it could be about anything, whatever you want to talk about. I was like, what do you mean, whatever I want to talk about? You have to tell me, you're inviting me. You have to tell me what it is. Send me all the questions ahead of time so I can prepare. And I get that. But then it's performative, because then what are we going to learn from that, right? Like if you want to have a conversation, just come, let's talk and let's learn whatever is coming up, and maybe it goes great, maybe it doesn't go great, whatever happens will happen. But this is, you'd say, a strange kind of interaction. And I think with what was that phrase, this corner of the internet, and it's starting to be a thing of like, oh, that's only in that corner of the internet. The rest of the world doesn't do things this way. So if you want to deal with the rest of the world with mainstream media, you have to minimize it, thingify it, and put it in a little box, demystify everything about it, and present it as a token, and that's it. And you're going like, but it's not alive. I can't start thinking you, right? If I do that, right? Like it dies for me. And so, going on this project, these are some of the struggles I have to work through. It's like, so I have to know who I'm dealing with and how to approach them, and what reality to sort of try and magic, and in which case, if it's the static one, then that's it. That's just, it's sad, but that's how it is going to be, and hopefully it's going to come to life. But I'll pass it to you, Daniel.
No, magnificent. And so a few things, because I think what you're getting at is so big. So on the example that guy was saying on the sex, the fire truck, I was thinking they relate because a siren goes off, because it's hot, but different things and stuff like that. And then suddenly you go red. What's fascinating is red was, you could say, a non-relation. Not nothing, but a non-relation that then when you see it's a relation. So there's this moment where a non-relation becomes a relation. The non-relation is the mystery that then when you realize it's a subject, but you immediately need to find a new non-relation. And what's very critical is desire is kindled by a relation to non-relation, by a seeking of non-relation. When you go, oh my gosh, there's something there, then you desire to find it. And then when you find it, though, you need to immediately create a new non-relation. So you're excited to find it, on and on and on and on. And what I heard you saying when you were saying that you need content to go to context, but then that's content. So now you need context and you go to that, but now it's content. And there's the key here is following psychoanalysis. desire will always be alive because there's always a relation, not an object. The moment you get an object, you then seek, you're using the object, not for the object, but for the potentials of non-relation that are now in the object. So you're moving beyond, you're moving beyond, you're moving beyond. This is where too, like when you were saying idle talk about the vacuum plate, idle talk is idolatry talk because idle talk tends to die because it's about things, the vacuum cleaner. So desire dies because desire dies as soon as you get the object, as soon as you get the money or the new job. What happened? It dies, right? People get what they always wanted. It goes away. Desire is kept alive by relation. And so the problem is that most people, when they engage in a conversation, talk about things, as opposed to in a conversation like this, where we are seeking non-relations, that once we find, we then seek new non-relations, new non-relations, new non-relations, new non-relations, which is a participation in the mystery that keeps desire alive. And then the desire becomes primary to the intellect, because you know when you find that non-relation. This is the key. You feel it. That's a non-relation. That's it. And now there's and if I found it before, there could be again, and you're going and going and going and going. So the desire keeps alive because desire is kindled by relation, and it is kindled particularly by the non-relation, which is not nothing, but the yet to be found relation, that then as soon as you find it, you create a new non-relation, on and on and on. Desire is created by relation. You cannot solve a meaning crisis without desire. Because what are you saying when you say red? Meaning. There's a meaning there. They're all red, right? So what you're doing is you create meaning has to be something you desire. Like if meaning is definitions in a book, that's not what we're talking about. Meaning has this desire quality, and it has meaning because I know it according to my desire. There's meaning here because there's a relation, and the meaning keeps going because I can find more and more relations. More and more non-relations. And you see, conversation that tends to be bad are the ones that reify thingness or objects, or you were talking they want a script, right? Well, there's no non-relations. We know everything we're going to talk about. That's what you're doing in a podcast is you're looking for people who are going to explore non-relations for you and have their desire kindled in that search for the non-relation by the very non-relation that becomes a relation. So then you're kindled to find a new non-relation, on and on and on and on. And then it becomes a wheel turning its own wheel. And you're avoiding objects because there's a way in which you could say that we are perpetually in jeopardy of idolatry, because we are perpetually in jeopardy of speaking of reifying thingness, not relation, or subject or script, not the relation. Why I think you're correct to have this kind of, well, but then it's dead, it's all going to be according to plan. There's a real sense in which the conversation itself has to be the grounds of its own intelligibility in being the gathering of people seeking non-relation, and the finding of non-relation is what is alive. And if you know everything that you're going to say, then it feels like idolatry. It feels like you're sinning almost. It feels like you're doing something wrong. Because in a sense, in a kind of metaphysical sense, you are. Because you're trying to get to the essence of the conversation, not knowing it by its effects. Because what are they saying? Well, what's the essence of the conversation going to be before we go in? Let's plan it out so we'll have an essence, right? Well, you don't know people or conversations by their essence. You know them by their effects. So what you're doing is, I want to gather people together that will create effects that then we can know non-relation, which kindles desire. And the only way to really know is according to desire. And if you bring a script, you threaten the kindling of desire, which is the intimate way of knowing. And then this also would mean if desire has this sort of kindling in the act of finding non-relation, then it's a surprising thing. Surprise is what creates desire. I didn't know this was going to happen. And you have to be very aware of all of these kind of temptations to create an essence that will then remove the possibility of knowing, because you only know by effect. But why do people talk about things? Why do people create plans? Because they're scared. They're afraid. Fear, the one who fears cannot be made perfect in love. Fear is the opposite of faith. Fear removes love, right? So what ends up happening is, because we're afraid, we commit idolatry in a metaphysical sense. And so then we don't know anything except a gold calf, and that doesn't do us very much. And so I think also the last thing I'll say that was coming to mind, well, I guess I would also say this is relation creates desire, which creates meaning. So you need to go. So whoever's listening, you need to go into the area of your life where you find yourself capable of ever creating relations. If you can figure out what in your life is the thing where you can ever create relation, because you can ever find non-relation, and then find non-relation, that is where you will find your quote unquote meaning. That is where you will find your fittedness, your gutter, all of that with the apathetic. Because you're all, what is a non-relation? It's apathetic. It's not nothing. It's this thing that's relation, and then it keeps going and it keeps going. So maybe you have a magical ability, maybe you have a special ability to find non-relation in engineering, mathematics, and conversation. Whatever that is, where you find yourself with a certain capacity to find non-relation, that is the place where your desire will live forever. That's where your desire will live forever. And so you need to identify that. And then the question is, how do you have the capacity to generate these non-relations? Now, there is something to be said. The moment you start talking about non-relations, though, it's scary, right? You're dealing with the unknown, right? So this is why you have to read, climb mountains, build capacity, face the real, develop courage, so that when you seek the non-relation, what Lacan calls the real, doesn't destroy you. So now we start seeing why you have to prepare, why you have to do work to make them. It doesn't just happen. There has to be a certain building of capacity to recognize, to sense the non-relation and to handle the non-relation, so that then when you do a conversation like this, like you're saying, it's not one where you go, you know, you're just waiting, right? There has to be that. So there's a capacity here, but here's the key. You are building, as an individual, you are building your capacity to handle the non-relation that only comes out with other people, of which makes possible effects of yourself, without which you couldn't know yourself. And now we see where individual seeking of capacity is in service of a relation. You are trying to be capable. The work you do as an individual is for you to be able to handle relation, and for you to be able to seek non-relation, and so that the desire also that you kindle is in service of those other people, so that the interiority that you have can surprise you, and their interiority can surprise the other. And now we start seeing how the individual's own private work in the monastery, in silence, learning to listen, they can then bring to the relation to make possible a handling of the effects that come out in the mystery of the non-relation. So there's the capacity to kindle that and to keep it alive, and those things then service one another. And then, you know, to always be looking for the next non-relation. The last thing I was quite taken when I think when it was the idea of struck me. What you said struck me. That's very interesting, because you strike the table and you know the interiority, right? You were talking about how you hear to get to the interiority. What's so funny is when you say something that strikes me, I hear my interiority for the first time. And then I respond to where you hear my interiority in a way you wouldn't have. Right? So there's a way in which we're constantly striking one another, like hitting a pen to know the material of the vase, that then helps us hear our interiority, and we're surprised by that otherwise we would never know, that now I can share with you, and maybe that will strike you and you'll hear your interiority, and then we'll share it back and forth, and we're all engaged in this striking one another to hear our own interiorities.
Yeah. In some sense.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in like real quick?
Yeah.
Just to supplement that, just something short. While he was talking, I was drawing verses.
Yeah.
Trying to together.
Absolutely.
So they can hear the interiority. And he said verses, and I was like, wow, it's like it's like next level.
You heard the interiority. Surprising, right? There you go. Bam, the effects.
Sorry, guy.
It's one of the things I've tuned in on over the years in circling, is whenever I hear somebody go, I was like, I'll point over and I'll say, can you put the subtitles on that? Say that in another way, right? And then they'll be talking, right? And then somebody else will go, like, would you like that? And if you just do that, at some point we'll all end up in God. Is following this struckedness, right? My internet or my Zoom keeps telling me that my internet is unstable. And whenever it does that, I always think, you have no fucking idea. You think my internet's unstable. Let's talk to my wife, right? Gentlemen, in other words, this is probably a good time for us to bring this to a another opening. It's been absolutely a gift, a pleasure, and a delight.
It has been, Guy. I've enjoyed it, and I love you both. This has been a delight. So now I'm going to hear like the hitting of vases.
Yes.
You know,
Right,
and
right.
we need we need politics, economies, everything needs to like be designed to make people go
Yeah.
And it is interesting because you have that tradition of as if that's kind of the sound So that kind of like and it is interesting. What do people do when they're happy? They sing music. There's a kind of expression of interiority that only comes out because of being struck in a certain way. So thank you for the music, gentlemen. It's been a treat.
Absolutely.
It's been a wonderful privilege and pleasure, and I look forward to the next one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll get it scheduled. All right.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bestie, gentlemen. Thank you. All the